The Ouija board. This story was actually from my mother when she was younger. She said one time when she was a teenager, she was curious and thinking it would be a fun experience playing with the Ouija board. Her and a group of her friends got together and started asking some questions to the Ouija board. Everything was going great until the planchette started moving on its own without anyone touching it. Slowly, it spelled out, "I will follow you forever." Everyone started screaming and panicking, and without knowing how to close the session out, they just put the board away, and that was a big mistake. As my mother was watching TV with my grandma, she heard a noise from the kitchen, and she decided to check it out. As she walked into the kitchen, a dark shadow-like entity with large, angry eyes then launched at her, causing her to scream in terror. My grandmother, who was right behind her, only saw my mom fall backwards and never saw the entity. She tried to calm her down, suggesting that she might have imagined it, and things went back to normal for a while. Later, my mom went on a trip to Laredo to buy some merchandise to sell during a bus stop. My mother went to the bathroom, and suddenly everything around her darkened, and she heard the bathroom door lock from the outside. Terrified, she started screaming and asked for help, but people who were outside couldn't open the door. She felt dozens and dozens of roaches crawling all over her feet. She began to scream louder than ever. But minutes later, the lights turned on, and someone opened the door, and everything went back to normal, just like if it was a nightmare. These strange incidences began happening more frequently, and the angry-looking entity kept bothering her, apparently unexpectedly. Eventually, my mother started dating a man who would eventually become my father. He knew a lot about these entities and also about being a Freemason. He helped my mother do a lot of these experiences and helped her overcome most of them, but sadly, he passed away in 2020. After he passed away, the paranormal experiences returned to my mom's life, knowing that her protector was now gone. The new car. This actually happened to my cousin, and this happened when I was about 17 years old. At the time, I was really close to my cousin, who was a year younger than me. We got along great, almost like brothers. Being an only child, my parents always encouraged me to connect with family, so I wouldn't feel lonely. My cousin and I became very close. Because of this, we often went to parties at our friends' houses. We pretty much were healthy kids, maybe having a couple of drinks to feel grown up, but it wasn't a habit. One day, my cousin got called to go to a friend's house. He asked me to get permission from my parents so that we could spend the night there, which I did. When I got to our friend's house, everything was normal, like always. We played board games, video games, and talked about stuff 17-year-old kids usually talk about. Everything was going great. But that was until the friend who owned the house that we were spending the night at suggested we play with the Ouija board. He mentioned he bought one at a garage sale and wanted to see if it really worked. Since we had never played with one before, everyone at the party agreed, and they started playing with the planchette. The planchette moved, and my cousin was skeptical, saying the players were moving it, and he didn't believe it. The owner of the board asked him to play along, just touching the planchette lightly without moving it. Skeptical, my cousin did that, and our friend told him to start asking questions. My cousin asked if anyone was there, and the planchette quickly moved to yes. making us all laugh a bit nervously. Then my cousin asked what the entity's name was, and the planchette spelled out Pazuzu. None of us knew what that meant, but the board's owner warned my cousin, be careful. I've heard of this entity. If it's really Pazuzu, it can guess anything and grant anything. To which my cousin half-jokingly said, oh really? Okay, can you give me a new car? The planchette moved to yes. Our friend quickly said, don't do it. It will ask for something in return. My cousin asked, and what could it ask for? Our friend replied, I don't know, but don't do it. We were thinking this was just a joke. And with everyone watching, my cousin said, give me a new car. What do you want in exchange? The planchette didn't move. Tell me what you need. What do you want from me? My cousin said again, I want a new car. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the scariest thing happened. Our friend, who was conducting the session, looked creepy and stared right at my cousin and said, I want your parents to divorce. What? My cousin asked. The guy once again said in a possessed voice, you want a new car? I want your parents to divorce, but if you don't do it, I will. Then our friend looked down again. My cousin asked, why did you say that? But our friend seemed not to remember saying anything at all. Everyone in the room was silent and confused about what happened, and that's when my cousin said he didn't want to play anymore. So they closed the session with the Ouija board, and we decided to head back to his house. He still thought the whole thing was a prank by our friend. Time eventually passed, and for some context, his family was doing great. My aunt and uncle and two cousins, the one a year younger than me and his little brother, just a kid, lived together without anything happening for a while. My cousin finally turned 17, and his parents threw a huge party at home. He didn't really want to say he was grown up, and he wanted to celebrate it with his friends, but his parents convinced him to have some cake and spend a little time together before going out with his friends, and my cousin agreed. They celebrated, they cut the cake, and everything was perfect. Then my uncle said, don't use my car anymore. You're still too young. But your mom and I got you a gift. Look out the window, son. And there it was, a brand new car. My cousin was grateful to his parents for the gift, but started remembering the Ouija board incident. When it said, you want a new car? I want your parents to divorce. But if you don't do it, I will. Then he began to worry. He might actually have to break up his parents' marriage. But in the end, he thought it was just a coincidence. Later on, my uncle asked my cousin to go to the supermarket. My cousin agreed, and as he was leaving, his little brother asked if he could come along with him. My cousin agreed. After all, he had just gotten a new car. They both hopped into the car, but right before reaching the supermarket, they had a severe accident, and only my older cousin survived. My aunt and uncle couldn't handle losing their youngest son and ended up getting divorced. Everything went south from there, and his family was destroyed after this. I have never dared to play with the Ouija board again, and I'll never do it. I don't know if it was a weird coincidence, but I'll never be tempted to play with one again. Thank you for listening to my story. True paranormal story number 2. True Ouija board story. In 1997, I was 13 at the time, And at that age, when most of us like to investigate with curiosity in the world around us, it's no longer just having sleepovers with friends, playing various video games, or getting into high school sports. Girls were starting to become appealing. This was a time when professional wrestling was just starting to really take off, and a group of my friends were diving into horror movies and scary stories. This is something that's always appealed to me ever since reading scary stories to tell in the dark. I was hooked when this series came out. I was about 8 years old. They sold them at our scholastic book fair. Looking back, these stories and illustrations were way too intense for 8-year-olds, in my opinion. But I really did enjoy them. We all loved to be scared. My friend Philly and I enjoyed getting together to watch horror movies and scare each other with urban legends. We started doing this almost all the time, especially during the summer when school was out. Of course, this was pre-internet time, so all we had media-wise was actually renting a movie or physically going to the theater. After renting the same movies over and over, we often just focused on urban legends that we now call creepypastas today. We might find some books at the library that had them, or we just made up our own, but we really wanted to feel some actual terror. I wish we could have just stuck with our stupid scary stories. So when me and my friend Philly were at his house alone, we went to his sister's room, and we had the idea to pull out a Ouija board from under her bed. Again, we made sure that no one was home when we pulled it out. The board was really glossy and it looked new, as if nobody ever played with it. So we did 2 sessions with this device, but this was enough to keep me away for 22 years after doing it. The first session was incident-free. We asked a few silly questions, me and my friend Philly, like what our future held, if we will get married and have kids, stuff like that. Even though I never played this before, I still knew not to ask certain questions, like what was the name of the person we were talking to. Maybe we figured that out from all the hours spent watching scary movies. It was a second session when things got weird. Philly and I were going back and forth with the board, asking simple questions about our lives. I remember asking where I would live as an adult, and the board said Seattle. I was living 20 miles away from Seattle at the time. This is when I felt the aura of the board shift and the air, because static was brewing all around us. I could tell you that everything that was going on was real, and neither one of us was moving the oracle. My hands weren't even on it at some points. But back to the Seattle question. Around this time, I was researching the city of Seattle because one of my favorite baseball players, Ken Griffey Jr., played for the Seattle Mariners, and that was my favorite team at the time. The next couple of questions is a blur to me, and all I remember is the oracle going mostly to the word no when we asked a question, even if it wasn't a yes or no question that was required. Then I asked the last question that I would ever ask the Ouija. I asked, would the Detroit Tigers ever win another World Series? The oracle moved so fast to goodbye. I looked at my friend Philly, and his eyes were bulging out and his mouth was wide open. I had the same expression on my face. We knew that once the board said goodbye, you're supposed to put it away immediately. We threw the board into its box, took it back to his sister's room as fast as we could. My friend Philly chucked it under the bed like nothing happened. After a while, me and Philly started letting out tiny little laughs, lighting up into big belly laughs as we hit the floor rolling. We were laughing out the nervousness that we felt during the game. We were making fun of ourselves, of how dumb and scared we looked while we were playing the Ouija board game. My friend Philly lived in the country area across the street from a cemetery, and there weren't many houses around, and it was about a 15-minute hike just to walk to the neighbor's house. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, we finally got tired from playing video games. That's when we decided to step outside, and we looked at the graveyard that was across the street from his house and began talking about how calm the night was. And I remember there wasn't any wind at all. Then, behind us, we heard movement, and my friend Philly's bushes started shaking. We started hearing growling, and it definitely didn't sound like a dog. It sounded much larger than a regular animal, and it was coming from the bushes around his house. To this day, I don't know what it was, and I don't care to know what it could have been. We knew something wasn't right, and we both headed straight for his house. Even now, writing this down, I can feel an eerie presence. We both knew somehow this was related to the board. Philly, my friend, suggested that we call it a night and try to get some sleep, but to tell you the truth, I wish that was the end of the story. Just a few short hours later, we woke up to the sound of knocking. Sounds that I couldn't determine where they were coming from, but it sounded like it was outside the house. We both went downstairs and looked out the front door. I slowly peeked outside. I saw something that made my heart drop into my stomach. A man was standing right outside the door. He didn't move. He just stood there. We once again fled to his room and slammed the door shut. We didn't call the police or tell his mom. We just sat in the room, not sure what to do. After a few minutes, we went by the front door again, just to see if the man was still there. And to my surprise, he was gone. The next day, after I had gone home, I had got a phone call from my friend Philly, and he said he had a dream that we were playing the board, and a hand came up from the center and reached for his head. He said he tried to push it away himself, but he was moving in slow motion, like when you're trying to run away in a nightmare. He said the hand grabbed a fistful of his hair. Philly said he tried to scream, but nothing came out. The hand was forcing his head into the board. He then woke up, gasping for air, and felt pain on the top of his head, where the thing had grabbed him. I didn't want to admit this to him, but the scary truth was, I had the same nightmare. Me and Philly decided to meet up in person that night, and when I made it to his house, he told me to go to the backyard. And there he had the board. He told me his plan was to light the board on fire. After dousing it with gasoline, it finally erupted into flames and quickly burned into ashes. After that, as far as I can remember, nothing has happened, and we never spoke about this again. I have never touched or looked at a board again.